Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Valeria, and I am the volunteer with the Madhu Verma Migrant Justice Center. I want to welcome you to the fourth session of the Community Food Mentor Training, the Migrant Justice Edition, which is being organized by the Madhu Verma Migrant Justice Center alongside the support of Food for All. Before I get started, I want to let you know that the meeting is being recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable, you can turn off your camera and microphone as well. Today, we're very honored to have Dr. Andrea Bombak with us, who's going to be presenting about the sociable sustenance, sociocultural exploration of health, food, and body. Dr. Andrea Bombak is an associate professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick. She's a critical weight health service and public health scholar whose research critically explores messaging and policy concerning the obesity epidemic and the lived experience of weight stigma. She has led quality projects on bariatric surgery, body acceptance, weight stigma, post-secondary food education, and understandings of weight and health in Canada and the US. Before I pass it along to Dr. Andrea, I want to let you know that the chat is available. At the end of her presentation, we have 10 minutes for questions, so she'll be more than happy to address your questions and any concerns. And again, we're here. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea. Without further ado, I pass it along to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm just gonna call up my slides now for you. Okay, is that clear for everybody?
We can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so as Valeria introduced, this presentation is called Sociable Sustenance, Sociocultural Explorations of Health, Food, and Bodies. But really, this is just because I'm obsessed with alliteration. And so I just love thinking of titles that are like this. And this is actually going to be primarily a presentation on a particular research study that I conducted here in New Brunswick a few years ago. That has been, at least some of the findings have been recently published in various peer-reviewed journals. And so they're available to individuals that might be interested, and all the other findings are currently under review at other publications. And that study is weight stigma and health inequities in New Brunswick marginalized communities. So I'll start a little bit by talking about sort of my research agenda more generally, so that you can kind of appreciate the context from which the idea for this study derived. Okay. And so I do want to recognize that a large team was involved in carrying out the project that I'll be speaking about more specifically. All of these individuals were students at the time of this work, and all of them have subsequently graduated and have gone on to do a variety of magnificent things. And so that included Samaya Akhar, Courtney Burke, Norma Chinho, Kathleen O'Keefe, Lisa Thompson, and Lee Turner. So in terms of that context from which this particular study derived, what we know is that our kind of social environment is rife with weight-based forms of stigmatization. And so you'll see different terms being used with respect to the idea of weight stigma. You might see discrimination, which is often speaking more specifically about like a kind of behavior. Or you might see discrimination being used in terms of policies. Weight stigma is often used more of an umbrella term and can incorporate also things like attitudes and prejudices and beliefs. But what we know is that weight stigma is highly pervasive. It's been reported in a variety of different kinds of contexts, in the healthcare system, in school, work, and social and family situations, and within interpersonal kinds of relationships as well. And it has also spread globally. And so previously we would sometimes talk about the idea of sort of maybe the term now would be like more body positive kinds of nations that would kind of, we could see that in different sorts of surveys. But what we see now is the idea that this kind of weight stigma and pejorative attitudes that attach to weight have really spread all throughout the world. And as a note around language for this presentation, I'll probably wind up using the word fat. I might use the term higher weight. And when I use those terms, I mean them in a non-pejorative sense. I mean them just in a neutral sense as a descriptor of different kinds of bodies. And if I use obesity, I'll often do so with sort of, even if you can't see me doing this, attach this in your mind, the idea of air quotes around it, to kind of highlight the contested nature of the pathologization of being at a higher weight. And so the idea that it is necessarily unhealthy or a form of disease to be at a higher weight. The sort of clinical definition for what constitutes obesity is having a body mass index of 30 or above, and that is just a measure of one's weight over one's height and doesn't take into account things like muscle or bone mass. It's just a particular kind of number. So another thing that's important when we think about the idea of weight stigma very generally is when we think about the kinds of messaging that we encounter or the kinds of discourses, communications around weight that we might encounter. And so some of those that, sort of tend to surround us wherever we're at focus on the idea of the obesity epidemic and that this is like a time bomb or a crisis, that this is something that, should be very alarming and something that we tend to sensationalize. I remember speaking once with a reporter, and that person pointed out, and this was the middle of COVID, and she was saying, like, we are always talking about this epidemic, but people aren't really like dropping like flies, like from this idea that everyone is getting heavier. And in fact, like, no, up until relatively recently, life expectancy tends to have been going up. And when we tend to see, those sort of drops in life expectancy, sadly, that might be, a result of things like the opioid epidemic. And that might be a result of things like the fact that we're seeing, increasing rates of suicide, for instance. But there's tends to be this highly sensationalized view that you see around weight and this idea of it being a time bomb. You also tend to see that the most frequent framing in the media with respect to weight is that it's a matter of personal responsibility and that everybody can sort of control their weight if they just tried hard enough. And what we know is that I think anyone that's ever had a body can speak to the idea that this doesn't take into account the really highly complex socioeconomic circumstances in which individuals live, but it also doesn't even take into account what we know about the physiology of things like weight loss. And I'll speak a little bit more to that later. You also see that how we've tended to construct something like fatness has changed over time. In relatively recent history, what you've tended to see is this idea that the obesity epidemic is something that is spreading from other populations to middle class and upper class white populations. And so oftentimes you'll come across things like this sort of sensationalized and often very stigmatizing kind of media that suggests the idea that fatness is coming from individuals who might be of lower socioeconomic status, or it might be coming from individuals who are indigenous or individuals who are from colonized nations, and it's spreading, for instance, to settlers, or it's spreading from people of color to white populations. And so very frequently what you see is coded language in certain instances. So you'll see particular kinds of names that get used in media articles to suggest that it's certain populations who are fat, and then they are dangerous or risky to individuals who are privileged by, for instance, white supremacy. Or in some cases, it's actually far more overt than that. And there just really is kind of an outright statement around the idea that sort of, white middle-class individuals have to watch out for the idea that this kind of body size that it has been denigrated socially is spreading to them almost contagiously. And so these are some of the different kinds of discourses and communications and messages that we tend to come across when it comes to weight. And these sorts of stereotypes that individuals who are in larger bodies are somehow worse or lazier or less motivated than individuals who are in thinner bodies, for an example. And I see less and less of this, but for a long time, there tended to be this idea that, as we'll talk about, stigma is almost good in certain instances, that somehow stigma is going to be motivating for individuals. And this is fundamentally wrong on any number of levels. From a social justice perspective, obviously, we should not be advocating for stigmatizing anybody, but we should also know from a public health perspective that stigmatizing something, is not something that is going to be motivating for individuals. And what we do know with respect to weight stigma is that if you're someone who has encountered weight stigma, and weight stigma can affect anybody, it tends to more frequently affect those who are of higher weights, but anybody can encounter weight stigma. We know that encountering it, experiencing it is associated with a variety of different kinds of adverse health outcomes. It's associated with increased biological stress. So the kinds of things like the hormones that you give off when you're encountering stress and the kinds of physiological responses that your body has to stress. We know that encountering stigma produces that. We've also seen it associated with increased risk of things like cardiometabolic kinds of disease, and even sometimes some incident disease as well, the development of certain kinds of disease. And it's especially bad for people's mental health. And we know that it's associated with a lot of negative mental health outcomes, as well as a variety of different kinds of sort of like adverse behavioral mechanisms too. Like, for instance, if you think that your doctor is going to stigmatize you, why would you go and see your doctor? And this is one of the most common findings that you tend to see is things like healthcare avoidance. You might also see things like, people avoiding, exercise facilities as well. And we also know that another thing that can have really profoundly negative effects for individuals' health is what we call internalized weight stigma. And that's when you come to kind of take on some of those beliefs about yourself that are those sort of stereotypes that are associated with some of these more weight stigmatizing kinds of attitudes. And that is especially associated with poor kinds of negative mental health outcomes as well. And we know that even with respect to this idea that somehow stigma is going to be motivating and beneficial, lots of these effects actually persist even if people lose weight. A lot of these negative kinds of associations can persist over time. And we also know that because weight stigma can occur in places like within people's job circumstances and with respect to education, that it can have an effect on people's socioeconomic status. And this, of course, is one of the things that has one of the most profound effects on our overall health and well-being. So one thing that I want to very quickly go over is some of the myths and sorts of oversimplifications that we tend to see very commonly get reproduced over and over and over again with respect to weight. And so it's not that you don't necessarily see some of these findings, popping up in the peer-reviewed literature, but it's also that you tend to see findings that contradict these, or you tend to see more uncertainty or ambiguity or nuance frequently with respect to these ideas when you go a little bit deeper, then you often might see sort of like repeated over and over again, or that you might see getting printed in the media. And so some of the ideas that you come across are just really oversimplified. And so you might see studies that contradict some of what I'm going to be speaking about. But it's just important to note that, there's also uncertainty with respect to some of these ideas that are very commonly repeated and can be used to kind of shore up some of that stigma. And so one of these is that the body mass index is a good measure of health. And again, the body mass index is where you draw that definition of what obesity technically is. And it is just a measure of somebody's weight over somebody's height. And remember how I talked about the idea that underlying weight stigma is a lot of other kinds of stigmatization and a lot of other kinds of oppression as well. And so you see that, underlying weight stigma is an awful lot of, colonial attitudes, an awful lot of racism, an awful lot of classism. And one thing that is a really good indicator of this is our reliance on the BMI, because people come in all different shapes and sizes, and this is often a reflection of sort of like, the geographic location that their ancestors might have been from and how they adapted to things like the climate and the sun, and that can result in all kinds of different things like different limb lengths. And so we know that the BMI is not good looking across, the diversity that you might actually encounter. And so you will come across far different body types, just generally, just as a generalization, when you have sort of like Inuit populations as compared to, Australian Indigenous people, different kinds of limb proportions that are a reflection of things like how much sun is readily available in those areas. And yet you're still applying the exact same measure that's supposed to be telling you what the ideal kind of body size is necessarily meant to be. So we know that the BMI is not a good indicator with respect to the vast diversity that you encounter across the earth. But we also know the BMI isn't even really all that good a measure of adiposity, right? Adiposity meaning fatness, because it doesn't take into account how much of what you're looking at is bone and how much of what you're looking at is muscle. It's just weight. And so it also doesn't work very good for instance, athletes. It doesn't work very good for people who have short limbs. It doesn't work very well for an awful lot of different population groups. And the other thing about it is, and this, I swear I won't go into too much math, but one of the first things that they teach you in any epidemiology class is going to be the ecological fallacy. And this is the idea that you can't take something that's intended to look at a population and apply it to an individual. It doesn't make mathematical sense because it presupposes that the individual that you're looking at is the standard average individual, and the standard average individual doesn't exist. So you should never actually see the BMI, which is designed for populations and not that great even for that. You shouldn't ever see it being used clinically to apply to an individual, because that individual is going to be unique in a variety of different ways and that measure won't work. But you see this being reused over and over and over again. And as someone who went to all the obesity conferences, it was really interesting because there was a major push sort of to abandon it, to recognize the limitations of the BMI, but it gets used and it is persistently used because it's really, really easy to do so. It's easy and it's cheap. And so another thing that you tend to see with the BMI is that you tend to see that when you try to divide people up into these different categories, as we have tended to do and as we have historically done, where you have individuals who fall into, and again, picture scare quotes, the underweight categories, the normal weight categories, the overweight category, and then you usually have obesity, and you might have obesity class 1, class 2, and class 3. What you actually find is that if you look at people's health more in depth, they don't fall into these categories very easily based on their actual health. And so what you might see is that, for instance, in the normal weight category, about a third of individuals actually have cardiometabolic health risk. In the overweight category, about half of individuals are cardiometabolically healthy. About a third of individuals in the obese category 1 or class 1, you still tend to see that a third of individuals are metabolically healthy. So it's really not a particularly good measure of health, but we persist in using it. And now we're using it as a diagnostic criteria for giving people medication because it's so easy to use. Another thing that's important to note with the BMI is that we have also changed those categories over time, and we've made them more stringent. So you could be at a higher weight and be considered normal weight several decades ago, and we made the categories more stringent. So in part, when people talk about things like an obesity epidemic, part of that is just because we changed the categories, and people who went, to bed, as we sometimes say, healthy, woke up the next day, obese because these categories had been changed. Another indicator of this is this other myth, which is this, or at least oversimplification, that fat is a killer. What you actually tend to find is that people who are in the overweight category, that is actually the category that is associated with the lowest risk of mortality risk. And you don't tend to see risk going up with respect to mortality outcomes until you get to the extremes. And that includes extremes of underweight as well. And so, like I mentioned, that reporter who once said to me, people aren't dropping like flies. No, they're really not. It's at extremes where you start to tend to see mortality risk actually going up. The idea that the next generation will not live as long as their parents has always driven me nuts, because it's what we call a zombie study, which is a study that gets reproduced and talked about over and over and over again, the way that you might talk about like misinformation or disinformation with respect to social media nowadays, but is actually not a particularly good study, or it's a study that's sort of been repudiated over time. This was a study that was based on a back of the envelope kind of calculation that was done based on the assumption that obesity rates would persist as they had been. This wasn't necessarily true. In a lot of contexts, obesity rates either plateaued or declined. And also that all mortality for anybody in a higher weight body could be attributed to obesity. And this is just illogical. It's kind of entertaining, but it's illogical. If someone gets struck by lightning, for instance, it doesn't matter what size body they're in, right? But these assumptions were baked into this study. And ultimately, what the study actually found, based upon these kinds of assumptions and based upon this back of the envelope calculation, was that people would die maybe, I think, something like 9 months earlier than their parents had. Like, it was not even a full year. And yet this was reproduced over and over and over again as part of that very sensationalistic kind of messaging around weight. Another kind of myth that you frequently come across is the idea that weight loss is the only way to improve health. And this is something that we know is not true. We know that, for instance, if you do things like if you eat fruits and vegetables, if you quit smoking, if you don't drink to excess, if you engage in physical activity, all of those things, independent of weight loss, can help to improve your health. And in some cases, those kinds of things are actually more likely to be sustained. And so they're more likely to produce long-term benefits to your health than weight loss, which is very often something that is transient. I mentioned stigma being motivating. Stigma is not motivating. Stigma is bad for people's health and well-being. And similar to stigmatizing people who have, HIV/AIDS or something, all of that is just going to produce avoidance, and it's going to produce different kinds of negative kinds of health outcomes. Similarly, the idea that body acceptance is bad for health. Actually, studies have indicated that for people who are in different kinds of behavioral interventions, so people who are doing things like particular kinds of exercise programs or different kinds of programs around eating, the people who do best in those programs are those who are the most accepting of themselves and who are of higher weight. And so it is not true that body acceptance is bad for health. And in programs where body acceptance is incorporated into weight neutral kinds of behavioral interventions to have people do things like engage in joyful movement and intuitive eating, we've seen long-standing health benefits when people are accepting of their health and well-being. We also know that weight loss doesn't necessarily improve quality of life. As I had previously mentioned, sort of those experiences of stigma can sometimes stay with people long term. Traditionally, the way that you could produce the most lost weight was through bariatric surgery. But what you tended to see sometimes with bariatric surgery was that things like depression, suicidality, and substance abuse issues would either persist or sometimes actually get worse with bariatric surgery. So it's actually quite mixed, where you sometimes see that weight loss might improve quality of life. And that can be very difficult to disentangle from other things. Like, is it exercise perhaps that is having that effect? Is it necessarily the weight loss? But weight loss is not like the panacea. It's not a magical cure that necessarily produces this. And perhaps one of the most important and one of the most consistent findings in what is an enormous and hugely self-contradictory kind of literature is that long-term weight loss is actually very, very, very rare. At a conservative estimate, 85% of individuals who have lost weight will wind up regaining weight. Something like 2/3 might wind up gaining more weight than they had originally lost. And this is one of the most consistent, if not the most consistent finding, I would say, within this literature. I remember during my many, many years ago, my PhD defense, I was talking about this, and I was talking about the idea that, you might have heard diets don't work, and it's kind of almost become a slogan, but this is actually something that we very persistently find in the literature, and it's almost like we're rediscovering it over and over and over again. And the night before I gave my PhD proposal defense, I had read yet another article where a doctor had arrived at this conclusion when he was looking at sort of like his overall clinical sample. And this was from 1950, but we continue to persist in the idea that, we're going to be able to change people's body sizes. And part of the reason why we can't is that it's actually really complicated. It's not just a matter of sort of like calories out versus calories in. We don't talk about this much anymore, but a huge component Not surprisingly, with respect to our body size, the same way it's a huge component of all different kinds of aspects of, our physiology is genetics. And so an awful lot of your size is just tied into your genetic code. And so that isn't something that can really be easily changed. But we also know things like people do burn calories at variable rates. And one of the things that plays a role in that is going to be things like people's weight trajectories. And so people who have been in heavier bodies, and who subsequently lose weight actually burn less calories. And so that can wind up having definitely an effect on people's abilities to sort of persistently lose weight over time and keep weight off. There's differences in things like fat oxidation. There's differences in different kinds of nutrient metabolism, but we very rarely talk about that, right? You've probably heard, what is it? Calories in and calories out is the kind of very common, message that people send out, and they don't talk about the fact that weight loss really isn't about willpower, because there's these persistent, redundant systems that are built into place physiologically to make you regain weight over which you have no control. Things like the kinds of hormones that your body is sending out to try and motivate you to eat. Things like the rate at which you burn calories. And like I said, that changes over time, and that changes depending on body size, and that changes depending on different kinds of weight trajectories. And all of those are things over which you have no control, in addition to things like your genes. And so, as I mentioned, basically the takeaway for all this is that the relationship between fat, fitness, and health is really quite complicated. And probably one of the biggest takeaways that we can arrive at is, really, as much of a cliche as it is, diets don't work. And just changing the message to, lifestyle changes do, or whatever, that isn't a radical enough statement. Lifestyle changes can be highly beneficial to individuals that need to make lifestyle changes that they think would benefit them overall, but it might not necessarily have that much of an impact on your body size. But having said that, we know that you can be an individual in a bigger body who is cardiometabolically healthy, as I mentioned, and you can be fit. You can be quite fit. And you can be an individual who's in a more slender body, and you might not be cardiometabolically healthy, and you might not be fit either. And that can speak to things like, for instance, physical activity. And you can do physical activity in all different kinds of bodies. But our messages have tended to focus so heavily on weight loss, and so heavily on the idea that it's only certain people who engage in physical activity, that it's actually quite demotivating. And as I mentioned before, people might wind up regaining weight over time through all of these involuntary mechanisms. But if they're still doing things like persisting in physical activity, they're still receiving the benefits of that physical activity. Whereas if individuals are focused on so much on weight loss, and then they wind up regaining lost weight, they won't see those benefits unless they are continuing to persist in things like physical activity, in things like making the kinds of choices with respect to eating that are beneficial for them. And of course, when I talk about choices, people's choices are limited also by things like their socioeconomic circumstances as well. And all of that pushes this conversation beyond the individual and to things that we could be doing on a more structural basis to improve people's lives as well. And so there has been a push for the idea of like weight neutrality, and the idea that if we are talking about things like how we can improve individual health, that it's not necessarily beneficial to be focusing so much on the idea of weight loss when the vast majority of individuals are going to wind up regaining any lost weight. And instead, it would make more sense to focus on the things that they could perhaps change I go to the Y every day and I see an abundance of different kinds of body types and people who have brought in their service animals and, people of different ages and people of, different kinds of abilities coming in, and that's a far more motivating and sustainable kind of message than one that focuses so much on weight. And then, of course, we have to talk about, how things like inequality and how things like differential income distribution has an effect on health and well-being as well. And so with respect to just the study that we did here in New Brunswick, one of the things that we wanted to focus on was intersectionality, because very frequently what we have tended to see with the literature in weight stigma, and you're starting to see this change a little bit, but traditionally it has tended to focus on populations that have benefited from white supremacy, individuals who are middle class, and individuals who fall within a particular kind of age group, very frequently also women. And so it's been kind of very narrow populations that have been focused upon. And there's been very few studies that have really looked at interlocking forms of oppression. And so this idea of overlapping and interlocking forms of oppression, these kinds of, intersecting kinds of oppressions. And of course, this risks becoming a buzzword. You see intersectionality being thrown around all over the place now. As well. And I think sometimes we use it when what we really are just trying to say is that not everybody is the same, which is a really important point, pointing out, that we should be trying to counter essentialism, and not all women, for instance, are the same, and not all men are the same, and not all gender diverse people are the same. It's really important, but it's not really intersectionality the way, Crenshaw or Patricia Hill Collins was trying to capture this idea of qualitative and unique experiences of interlocking and overlapping forms of oppression. And so this has been relatively infrequently studied in weight stigma. You're seeing more and more of it now, especially when it comes to things like sexuality, I would say. But this was still kind of an understudied area. And because I had just gotten my job at UNB, I really wanted to look at populations that seemed to be highly relevant to New Brunswick. And I wanted to get at things that would be really locally important and resident. And of course, we couldn't include everybody and every group that we thought might, really make the study important, but we wanted to focus on people who were higher weight, so who fell within that particular BMI category, who were also older adults, because at the time, I'm not sure if it still is, New Brunswick is always the oldest or the second oldest province in Canada. So I'm not sure where we are now, but we wanted to look at older adults because they're infrequently studied in the literature. New Brunswick is also often the poorest province in Canada. And so we wanted to look at lower income Canadians as well, particularly again, because now we tend to view the idea of fatness as being something that we associate with being sort of a lower class status, right? One of the most interesting analyses that I ever saw of this was looking at the actress Melissa McCarthy from the movie Bridesmaids, and they talked about how when it's Melissa McCarthy, the actress, and she's giving interviews, she's always presented in, lovely clothing and highly articulate. But then when she's doing things like an SNL skit, they always tend to frame her in these ways that are more pejorative and more suggesting of being lower class. Like she's covered in mud and she's shoving chips in her mouth or something like that. And so they were talking about this idea of how it is that we tend to look at body size through a lens of classism, right? And so we wanted to look at lower income New Brunswickers. We wanted to look at Francophone New Brunswickers because New Brunswick is very unique in terms of its politicized linguistic situation. And this, by the way, I'm very used to getting hate mail. This is the only thing that motivated hate mail with respect to this study, which I thought was fascinating. People were upset that we included francophones. We wanted to look at newcomers to New Brunswick. At the time, this was before New Brunswick had experienced kind of its population growth. And so at the time, what you saw was a lot of documents and a lot of kind of political push for the idea of trying to make New Brunswick more welcoming. But then you would see pushback in the media around the idea of making New Brunswick more welcoming. And of course, New Brunswick is an enormously white province. That's changing over time, but particularly when we started this study in 2019, this was a very, very, very white province. And we wanted to look at gender and sexual minorities because this was right at the time when they were starting to talk about closing Clinic 554. They hadn't yet, but when we started this study, they were just talking about closing one of the healthcare centers that was most important for gender diverse people in the province and for sexual minorities. We also wanted to include Indigenous Canadians, but we weren't able to get sort of a partnership going that could sustain that. And so we wanted to talk to people about what their recommendations were for healthcare, what their experiences had been like as people who were higher weight and who were also, fell into these other different kinds of categories as well. We wanted to ask them about spaces and places that they found welcoming or that they found discriminatory in New Brunswick. We did over 100 interviews. We had 55 participants. We also wanted to do kind of like an ethnography where we would go to these different places with participants and we would participate with them in different kinds of activities. So we went to different kinds of fitness centers. We went to malls, we went to all these different places, and then COVID happened. And so then instead of being able to go with our participants, we went ourselves to these different places and took notes about what we could see in terms of the degree of inclusivity that we came across, and the different degree of perhaps exclusivity that we came across as well with respect to those things. And the early interviews were all face to face, and then subsequent interviews all had to be done, online or over the phone. And I'll speak a little bit then to some of the findings that emerged with respect to these different kinds of populations. And as I mentioned, the older adults have been published. So that's in the journal Health. The lower income group has been accepted for publication. It will be out soon. And the sexual and gender minorities is out in the Journal of Critical Dietetics if people want to read it. And the last manuscript is under review. But with respect to older adults, some of the big findings that we came across were this idea of moral citizenship, which is what we labeled the idea that our participants really felt that they had a moral obligation to maintain their health and well-being. That idea that it's sort of all on them, right? And they could counteract any kind of, effect that their social circumstances might have, their genetics might have, just age in general might have, any of those things. They could counteract it if they sort of worked hard enough and were virtuous enough. And this speaks in part to that kind of messaging around weight that I had previously discussed, but also around aging as well. You might have come across this idea of what we call apocalyptic demography, which is where you might see messages all the time that say it's an aging population, society is going to crumble, the strain is too much, we're going to be overwhelmed. And this is, again, this very sensationalistic kind of messaging. And so some of our older adult participants had taken on this idea that it was on them, that somehow they were supposed to be able to counteract all of these different kinds of effects. What was also interesting and what I thought was pretty unique which is why we called this manuscript Bright-Siding Stigma, was they also seemed to think that as individuals who were being stigmatized, they could counteract that stigma if they just had a positive enough attitude. And so they would talk about the idea that, if they were really positive about things, they didn't have to experience stigma. So as this participant was saying, you know, if you're opening the door for negativity, you have to be positive. And if you're positive, then you don't get any of the negative. So instead of looking at stigma as something structural that we have to intervene on, we have to be a more inclusive society. We have to change these attitudes. The idea is more, well, if someone's stigmatizing me, it's because I'm being negative. I'm not being positive enough. And so this was really fascinating and honestly a little bit upsetting to come across in our data. Lee Turner was a master's student at the time of the study, and they looked at lower income adults, and they found very similar kinds of sort of like internalization and uptake of that very stigmatizing sort of neoliberal attitude that it's all about the individual and the individual can kind of control their own size and weight and health and well-being. And what they found was that individuals tried to cope with stigma very frequently by trying to control their experiences. And oftentimes this would mean sadly, avoiding things that were stigmatizing. And this came up repeatedly in all the different samples. And then also stoicism. So while the older adults talked about positivity and maintaining a positive attitude, what you saw with the lower income individuals was sort of like trying to not show emotion when they were encountering things like stigma. Jordan was one of the few participants who talked about the idea that they had internalized a lot of this messaging and they were trying to relearn. They were trying to relearn the idea that like fat people had value and that we shouldn't be associating people who are of higher weight with the worst of everything. But they talked very articulately about having to relearn those messages because those messages were everywhere. And the idea, as we had mentioned, that like we tend to look at body size through this lens of classism. For sexual and gender minorities, this was one group that you saw actually a fair bit of pushback against stigma. They reported a variety of different forms of stigma. So they talked about weight centrism, so that everything got attributed to their weight. They went to the doctor, with a missing arm, and the doctor would be like, oh, look, you're bleeding, it's probably because of your weight. Or, they would show up with an ear infection and it would be about their weight. So we call this weight centrism. And they talked also about like different kinds of microaggressions, like endless unnecessary testing. Like they wouldn't have a particular set of symptoms, but they would constantly be tested for different things. And just this idea of prejudice. And they spoke about this in terms of weight, and they spoke about this in terms of sexuality and gender as well. And so they talked about the idea that there was all this moralism that was placed on them, and that it was morally wrong for them to love who they loved, for instance, or to be in a larger body. And they talked about identity and self. And so they talked very frequently about intersecting aspects of who they were, and that sometimes they felt that it was almost this tipping point, and the fact that, they were perhaps trans and fat meant that they were too much for individuals to handle. And they talked about the importance of being advocates for themselves, but how that was too much for an individual to take on. So a little bit different from the other samples. And that instead this needed to be something that was, taken on by, for instance, political actors. Yeah. And so this participant says, I know a lot of people in the queer community who end up with eating disorders, especially from my partner's point of view, for example. They are already trans, right? Trans is already such a big label that they're going to face so much discrimination. So they can't also be fat, because if there are two things, that's too many things, right? And so it's an interesting look at intersectionality that we often don't talk about as being sort of like compounding, like additive, but in this case, it actually was their experience. With respect to newcomers to Canada, we had some interesting findings where individuals talked about the idea that with some exceptions, things like clothing sizes sometimes came up as an exception, but they actually felt more accepted in New Brunswick than they had sometimes in like their sending nations that they talked about as being more stigmatizing in terms of size. And so like oftentimes they had experienced stigma, but very frequently that stigma was something that they were remembering from like their sending nations and not necessarily in New Brunswick. But they did talk about this idea of feeling quite isolated in New Brunswick, where they said that people were sort of on the surface very accepting and friendly, but they didn't necessarily feel close to New Brunswickers in a way that they would have liked. But what came up very frequently was how inaccessible New Brunswick could be, especially in terms of the healthcare system, trying to get in to see a doctor, trying to navigate the healthcare system, and also with respect to transportation as well. And so this participant, as I mentioned, one of the exceptions that sometimes came up was clothing sizes, where they talked about the idea that they found it difficult to shop in New Brunswick, but that they, in general, found New Brunswick to be more accepting than they were perhaps used to. And Francophone participants talked about experiencing stigma based both on linguistic status, both on being Francophone and on being higher weight, although they've sometimes talked about having more acceptance in sort of like their hometowns, although not always, and more acceptance sometimes with their Francophone primary care doctors, although again, there were exceptions there too. But they talked again about the idea of just sort of avoiding situations where they thought they wouldn't be accepted. And so this is concerning. You don't want people to be avoiding things like healthcare. Because of the fact that, you know, stigma is so ingrained, that's concerning. And they also talked a lot about language tension and about the idea that they would sometimes feel like they were the French police if they were trying to get clarification or trying to get people to speak French. And they talked about performative bilingualism, which sort of drove them a little bit crazy, which is when someone would say hello, bonjour, and they would answer in French. And then they would be told, oh, I don't actually speak French. You know, like, oh God, I'll have to find someone for you. Like, we can't actually pull that off. And I think that this is a very powerful quote where this woman talked about when we moved here, my daughter, she started kindergarten. She had a problem with one eye. She needed an operation, and so she had the operation. But the next day I felt she was starting an infection. So I called the doctor, the specialist that operated her, and I couldn't explain myself to tell what she had. And you know what the answer was? Well, when you can express yourself, you'll call me back. And that was their experience in healthcare. So I do want to thank everyone who was involved in this particular study, who I named earlier. Also, Julia Sheehan, who was a student who helped with some of the early interviews. My research partner, Natalie Riediger, who helped with some of the initial grants, and the funders who were involved in funding the project. UNB, the Banting Research Foundation, and the New Brunswick Health Research Foundation. And I can answer any questions that anyone has, and I'll do that thing where people go through their references. There's an awful lot of them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea. I learned so much, especially about culture and colonization with weight. That was eye-opening. Never thought about that. I do have two questions right now. So the first one is, do you think diet culture and ideas about body weight are influenced by businesses that profit from them?
Yes. Yeah. I just wrote an article that was looking at pharmaceutical companies and how much pharmaceutical companies influence some of these conversations that we wind up having around weight. And so I think that that is a hugely persistent aspect in things. And so you see that something like Novo Nordisk, the creator of Ozempic and Wegovy, they have made an absolutely enormous amount of money from these kinds of medications. And you can see that, I mean, they are very influential with different kinds of organizations like Obesity Canada, which is one of the largest nonprofit organizations around weight in the world, not just in Canada. And they do things like they fund Obesity Canada, and then Obesity Canada produces things like clinical practice guidelines where they emphasize the importance of pharmaceuticals in treating the disease of obesity. And so I think very oftentimes you can kind of follow the money and you can see where the money comes from. And I think they play a role in things like the persistence of the BMI, because the BMI is now used as the clinical criteria for giving people those kinds of medications. And then those organizations then form partnerships with other kinds of corporations. So for instance, Weight Watchers, which is now, I think, called WW, it might have gone back to being called Weight Watchers, they now have managed to alter their business strategy. So they're selling those kinds of drugs themselves, for instance. And you also see that there's relationships between these organizations and things like, did you guys get like those ads endlessly for, I think it's called Noom. It used to show up on YouTube and it was like the psychological way to lose weight. Noom and Nutrisystem and all of those have interconnected relationships with these corporations as well. So I think it's one of the reasons why it persists. Yeah.
Wow. Shocking. My social media, my TikTok is full of Ozempic, and Hollywood stars and like there's important people in the media, like weight loss and people romanticizing it. Wow, shocking.
They're
The
being
second,
paid. Just
definitely.
like a lot of the influencers are being paid, yeah, by Novo Nordisk to push it, which is, and it's also bad for people with diabetes because there's shortages for a drug that would be helpful for them. Yeah.
The next question is, what type of places were identified to be non-inclusive or accessible to people in terms of weight in New Brunswick?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we had some really interesting findings around some of the places that people identified. And as someone who doesn't like nature, for me, it was very eye-opening to hear how much other people really enjoy the outdoors, because it's just not my thing. But people talked about transportation came up a lot. So like buses and planes came up very frequently. And this made me sad. People talked about things like fitness centers, and that one would come up quite frequently about not feeling, or at least anticipating that it wouldn't be inclusive. Interestingly, pools came up frequently as a place where people did really feel included. I think if they actually sort of got there, if that makes sense. And so one form of stigma that we sometimes talk about is anticipated stigma. You know, when you have people who might be avoiding a place, they're worried that they're going to encounter that. And then perhaps if they actually get there, they might not. And so we went with several participants to different pools and they talked about how much they loved being in the water, for instance. But frequently fitness centers would come up as being another place where people didn't feel included. And people would also talk about different places where they didn't feel included based upon other aspects of their identity as well. I know that newcomers often talked about feeling a different degree of acceptance when they were on campus compared to when they were in other places in New Brunswick, for instance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I encourage everybody else to send the questions in the chat, or if you feel comfortable to raise your hand and ask the question yourself, feel free to. We have another question in the chat. It says food banks and community kitchens are becoming popular in communities across Canada and New Brunswick. How do they change and impact the existing stigma around food and weight?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that comes up really frequently is a tendency to want to link food insecurity to weight status. And there's a really interesting piece of work. I think it's by Jenna Brady and Jackie Gingras, and it's called Because Obesity. And it speaks to this idea that when we're dealing with something like food insecurity and we're trying to think of a way of intervening and interceding with something as serious as food insecurity and with something that is as structural as food insecurity, that we have a tendency to perhaps throw all of the ammunition that we can think of. And so very often you would see, at least for a while there, according to their analysis, that you would use the idea of, well, we have to intervene when it comes to food insecurity because it's linked to obesity. People might wind up getting obesity, right, if they're food insecure, with the intent that this would result in more resources, more funding. And what's interesting about this argument is it's interesting on multiple levels. One thing is that food insecurity and higher weight actually isn't that well linked, apart from, I think it is women with young children. Like it's a very small segment of the population where you actually might see this relationship being played out. And then it also, I think, almost disarms the conversation, because why isn't food insecurity in and of itself concerning? Why do we have to say we need to intervene because food insecurity is linked to obesity? Why isn't it just food insecurity is bad, right? Food insecurity is a social justice and public health issue in and of itself. We don't need to be thinking of any other reason for why it's bad. And then it plays in to some of these stereotypes that can wind up reinforcing these different forms of weight stigma. And so you can see it wind up reinforcing some of that classism, wherein you're suggesting that only certain kinds of people are those who might wind up using a food kitchen or a food bank, or only certain kinds of people wind up in larger bodies, which of course isn't true. All kinds of people in the right kinds of circumstances might wind up in a position where they're food insecure, and all kinds of individuals have diverse body sizes. And again, we find this pretty consistently in Canada, where the relationship between socioeconomic status and weight, is not particularly clear cut. And so it tends to, negatively, I think, reinforce these ideas where we're trying to link two different issues, and by doing so, we're potentially creating both erroneous and problematic kinds of discourses through doing so, that are potentially reinforcing oppressions that aren't helping us move forward, which is everyone deserves food, everybody has a right to food, and bodies come in all different shapes and sizes.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? So I really want to thank you for this. I learned so much. I was like, oh my God, just like nodding and everything. It was very educational. And I appreciate your research as well for this. I'm so sorry for the hate mail that you
The Francophone thing was so weird.
found. And I did send in the chat more information about us, the Madhu Migrant Justice Center, about Food for All, and more about Dr. Andrea. You can find all her research and publishing public work in her in the UMB website. That's what I included. But I'm sure that if you have any questions, you'll be more than happy to answer to them if they email you. And thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your time, Dr. Andrea. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see everyone else again for our next two sessions next Wednesdays. And yeah, thank you so much. Again, if anyone has any more questions, please let me know and I can forward them to Dr. Andrea.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for staying late.